Welcome to Underwire History, Conference of Lakota Chiefs with General Miles at Pine Ridge Reservation. The Lakota agree to surrender, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. Escalating pressures reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. The conference at Pine Ridge Reservation was a culmination of escalating pressures. For months, Lakota bands had been moving east in search of food and grazing land. Their movements were met with increasing resistance from government officials and settlers. General Miles's military campaign to contain the Lakota had already shown its effectiveness. Lakota leaders like Sitting Bull and Bigfoot faced growing opposition within their own communities for resisting white encroachment. The pressure on them grew as the U.S. Army began to exert control over resources such as cattle and hunting grounds. In this context, the surrender agreement with General Miles was a strategic decision made within the parameters of what was possible given these multiple constraints. It allowed the Lakota to maintain some autonomy while avoiding further conflict, but it also effectively ended their resistance against encroaching white settlements. The surrender agreement's immediate consequence was the relocation of Lakota bands from their ancestral lands to reservations, where they were forced to adapt to a new way of life. Government officials and settlers saw this as a crucial step towards consolidating control over Western territories, but it also meant the loss of autonomy for the Lakota people. The federal government allocated land for reservation expansion, with some plots designated for agricultural use, while others remained open range. This shift had significant impacts on Lakota culture and economy, as they transitioned from nomadic hunting to a more sedentary existence based on farming and livestock production. The institutional response of the U.S. Army and government officials drove these changes, motivated by a desire to assert control over Native American lands and resources. As reservations expanded, so did tensions between Lakota leaders and federal authorities over issues like land distribution, water rights, and cultural preservation. Modern relevance reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. The government's policy of assimilation through education led to the forced integration of Lakota children into boarding schools, where they were forbidden from speaking their native language or practicing their traditional culture. This not only erased cultural identity, but also disrupted family structures and social bonds within the community. As the reservations continued to expand, new settlers began to encroach on Lakota lands, leading to conflicts over resource management and territorial control. Government officials responded by establishing a system of agencies to oversee Native American affairs, which often resulted in further marginalization and exploitation. Economic development plans pushed by federal authorities led to the introduction of wage labor and cash economy, replacing traditional subsistence practices. However, this also introduced new forms of inequality and dependence on outside assistance, undermining Lakota self-sufficiency and cultural resilience. With each step, options for resistance narrowed, as Lakota leaders found themselves caught between competing pressures from within their own community and the mounting demands of federal authorities. The consequences of these policies continued to unfold in the decades that followed, with the U.S. government's Indian Removal Act of 1830 forcibly relocating thousands of Native Americans, including many Lakota, to areas west of the Mississippi River. This policy had a profound impact on the tribe's demographics, as many families were torn apart and communities destroyed. The loss of traditional lands and resources further eroded Lakota cultural identity and economic stability. As the U.S. government continued to expand its territories, it also intensified its efforts to assimilate Native Americans through education and cultural suppression. By 1887, the Dawes Act had been passed, dividing communal land into individual allotments that could be sold or traded by individual tribe members. This led to further fragmentation of Lakota lands and resources, as well as increased dependence on government assistance programs. Despite these challenges, some Lakota leaders continued to resist forced assimilation, advocating for greater control over their own affairs and cultural preservation. One notable example is the work of Zitkala Shah, a Lakota writer and activist who used her platform to challenge the destructive policies of the U.S. government and promote Lakota self-determination. Her experiences in boarding schools and subsequent advocacy efforts highlight the ongoing struggle for Native American rights and recognition. The legacy of these events continues to influence contemporary debates over land rights, cultural preservation, and tribal sovereignty. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had a profound impact on the tribe's demographics, as many families were torn apart and communities destroyed. This policy had significant consequences for Lakota economic stability, as they were forced to adapt to new lands and resources. However, not all Lakota leaders accepted these changes without resistance, as some continued to advocate for traditional ways of life and cultural preservation. One notable example is the work of Zitkala Shah, a Lakota writer and activist who used her platform to challenge the destructive policies of the U.S. government and promote Lakota self-determination. Her experiences in boarding schools highlight the ongoing struggle for Native American rights and recognition, as well as the importance of preserving cultural identity in the face of forced assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887 further fragmented Lakota lands and resources by dividing communal land into individual allotments that could be sold or traded by individual tribe members. This policy led to increased dependence on government assistance programs, which had a lasting impact on the tribe's economic stability and cultural resilience. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had far-reaching consequences for the Lakota people. Many families were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in the east to reservations in the west, leading to the loss of traditional ways of life and cultural identity. This policy was a direct result of the U.S. government's efforts to expand its territories and assert control over Native American populations. As the removal process unfolded, Lakota leaders found themselves caught between competing pressures from within their own community and the mounting demands of federal authorities. Some Lakota leaders, such as Chief Little Crow, attempted to negotiate with the U.S. government on behalf of their people, but these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. The consequences of the Indian Removal Act continued to unfold in the decades that followed, as many Lakota families struggled to adapt to their new surroundings and resources. The loss of traditional lands and resources had a profound impact on the tribe's demographics, leading to a significant decline in population and cultural resilience. Despite these challenges, some Lakota leaders continued to resist forced assimilation, advocating for greater control over their own affairs and cultural preservation. The Dawes Act of 1887 had far-reaching consequences for the Lakota people, leading to increased dependence on government assistance programs. This policy exacerbated existing tensions within the tribe, as some leaders saw it as an opportunity to acquire individual property and wealth, while others resisted its implementation. As the years passed, the U.S. government continued to exert pressure on the Lakota people through policies such as the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to Native Americans, but also eroded their sovereignty. This policy was a direct result of the growing influence of assimilationist thinkers within the U.S. government, who saw tribal cultures as inferior and in need of civilization. In response to these pressures, some Lakota leaders began to advocate for greater autonomy and self-determination, while others continued to resist forced assimilation. The consequences of these policies were evident in the Lakota people's economic struggles, including high rates of poverty and unemployment, as well as a decline in traditional cultural practices and language use. Despite these challenges, some Lakota communities continued to thrive, preserving their cultural heritage and resisting the forces of assimilation through efforts such as language revitalization and traditional education programs. However, the legacy of these policies continues to impact the Lakota people today, with many still struggling to access basic services such as healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. The ongoing struggles of the Lakota people are a testament to the enduring power of colonialism and its legacy of systemic inequality and oppression. The Dawes Act's impact on Lakota land ownership was significant, leading to the loss of over 90 million acres of tribal land by the mid-20th century. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, marked a shift in U.S. policy towards Native American tribes, recognizing their right to self-governance and cultural preservation, but its implementation was often inconsistent and ineffective. In the post-WW2 era, the U.S. government launched the Indian Relocation Program, which forcibly relocated thousands of Native Americans from reservations to urban areas, leading to further dislocation and cultural disruption for the Lakota people. The Indian Claims Commission, established in 1946, provided a forum for tribes to contest historical grievances and secure compensation, but its impact was limited by the U.S. government's resistance to acknowledging past injustices. The 1960s saw a rise in Native American activism, with protests and demonstrations organized by groups such as the American Indian Movement, AIM, which sought to address issues like police brutality, land rights, and self-determination. However, the movement was often met with violent suppression, including the infamous 1973 Wounded Knee occupation, where AIM members clashed with federal agents in a confrontation that left 2 Native Americans dead and several others injured. Today, the Lakota people continue to face significant challenges related to poverty, healthcare access, and educational disparities, as well as ongoing struggles for land rights and sovereignty, highlighting the need for continued advocacy and policy reform to address these systemic issues. The Dawes Act's legacy of fragmented land ownership created a patchwork of tribal and individual lands, leading to disputes over jurisdiction and resource management. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act established the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, role in overseeing tribal self-governance, but its effectiveness was hindered by inadequate funding and inconsistent implementation. The BIA's reliance on paternalistic policies, such as assigning non-Native American agents to manage reservations, further eroded trust between tribes and the federal government. Tribal leaders like Charles Curtis, a Cancer Indian who served as vice president under Herbert Hoover, pushed for greater autonomy and self-governance, but their efforts were often thwarted by entrenched bureaucratic interests. The Indian Claims Commission's limited jurisdiction and slow pace of redress left many tribes frustrated with the lack of accountability from the U.S. government, which continued to assert control over tribal lands and resources. The 1960s activism was marked by events like the Alcatraz occupation, where Native American students occupied the island prison to protest poor living conditions and advocate for greater autonomy, highlighting the ongoing struggle for self-determination and cultural preservation. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.